page 83. The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living, by Jeff Volek and Stephen Phinney. An expert guide to making the life-saving benefits of carbohydrate restriction sustainable and enjoyable. Section 2. Perspective. Chapter 3. The Modern History of Carbohydrate Restriction. 3.6. The Food and Nutrition Board 2010. Now it is almost a decade after the WHO results have been tallied and digested, and we've seen many new studies published pertaining to carbohydrate-restricted diets. So we're making progress, right? Well, not if we look at the recent, June 2010, report of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, DGAC. This group of 13 nutrition experts, appointed by the Food and Nutrition Board at a group formerly chaired by Dr. Handler, who had advised caution about the original low-fat guidelines, is tasked with recommending nutrient intakes for the U.S. population. On the topic of dietary carbohydrate intake, they advised the USDA to define the minimum human requirement for dietary carbohydrate at 130 grams per day. And in their conclusions on low-carbohydrate diets, the DGAC states, 19. Diets that are less than 45% carbohydrate or more than 35% protein are difficult to adhere to, are not more effective than other calorie-controlled diets for weight loss and weight maintenance, and may pose health risk, and are therefore not recommended for weight loss or maintenance. In other words, the DGAC report is telling all Americans to consume at least 45% of their calories as carbohydrate, that there is no benefit to consuming less than this amount, and that in fact it may be dangerous to do so. Let's look at specific statements by this committee pertaining to carbohydrate. 1. Carbohydrates, sugars and starches, provide energy to cells in the body, particularly the brain, which is a carbohydrate-dependent organ. Italics added, 2. An estimated average requirement, EAR, for carbohydrate is established based on the average amount of glucose utilized by the brain. 3. The recommended dietary allowance, RDA, for carbohydrate is set at 130 grams per day for adults and children. What is remarkable to those of us with expertise in human metabolism is the DGAC's statement that the human brain is carbohydrate dependent, thereby mandating a high intake of dietary carbohydrate. Interestingly, this was written not by lawyers and journalists like the original McGovern Committee report, but by a committee of physicians and PhD scientists. They should know better. In fact, the human brain is a carbohydrate-dependent organ only if one routinely eats a lot of antictogenic nutrients such as sugars and concentrated carbohydrates. When dietary carbohydrates are held to 50 grams or less per day, humans undergo a process called ketoadaptation, causing the liver to make and release ketones into the bloodstream. After a few weeks of the ketoadaptation process, serum ketones increase several-fold, reaching 13 millimolar. Above 1 ketones, more than half of the brain's fuel comes from ketones. The rest of the brain's fuel must indeed come from glucose, but this amount, usually less than 50 grams per day, is easily produced endogenously by the liver from a metabolic leftovers via a process called gluconeogenesis. Thus, the brain uses glucose in varying amounts depending upon the availability of ketones. The manifest ability of the body to supply the brain with fuel independent of dietary carbohydrate intake clearly contradicts this committee's assertion that the brain is a carbohydrate-dependent organ. Simply put, this is a classic case of a false premise leading to a false conclusion. The DGAC's second statement, that low-carbohydrate diets may be dangerous, was referenced to 2 published epidemiological studies from Europe 2021. However, the committee members were also likely aware of a similar study done in the United States and about to be published by Harvard researchers. 22. This recent report evaluated the reported food intakes from the Nurses' Health Study and Health Professionals Follow-up Study, which looked at health outcomes over 26 years. Dividing the subjects into subgroups based upon reported dietary carbohydrate intakes, the Harvard researchers found a slight but statistically significant increase in mortality, 20%, in the group with the lowest intake of carbs. Based on these data, this influential group of authors declared most low-carbohydrate diets, particularly those containing animal products, as probably unsafe. Interestingly, the lowest carbohydrate intake group in the Harvard study cohort reported they consumed 37% of dietary energy as carbs, which translates into 185 grams per day for a person consuming 2,000 calories per day. Obviously, this level of carbohydrate intake is well above the level of restriction shown to facilitate fat mobilization associated with nutritional ketosis. Thus virtually no one within these study groups was keto-adapted, and this report has little relevance to the degree of carbohydrate restriction addressed in this book. As an aside, it is curious to note that this low level of carbohydrate intake that is deemed to be unsafe, 185 grams per day, is well above the minimum intake, 130 grams per day, regarded by the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee to be at the lower limit of safety. However, the most powerful argument against accepting this caution about low-carbohydrate diets expressed by the Harvard researchers is the fact that it was this same analytical technique, some of the same authors, and one of these two study cohorts, the Nurses' Health Study, that led us down the flawed path of prescribing hormone replacement therapy, HRT, to prevent heart disease back in the 1990s. Only after the prospective, randomized Women's Health Initiative data were analyzed did we, and they, discover that HRT actually causes heart attacks, and some forms of cancer, rather than prevents them. So after it was demonstrated to yield incorrect results then, it is fascinating that these same authors now trot out the same dead-on-arrival analytical method in an attempt to discredit low-carbohydrate diets. Some of the members of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee know and understand these facts. So why did they cave to the consensus and put their names on the committee's flawed report? The answer is not hard to guess. First, the committee was not chosen at random from among the hundreds of qualified scientists available to serve. It was selected to include individuals known to function well on a committee. Iconoclasts need not apply. Second, the committee membership includes a number of senior leaders in the field with considerable de facto influence over who gets papers published and grants funded, individuals whom someone a bit less senior in the field would not want to cross. Page 89.